Hello, this is Dr. Harriet Fraud, bringing you another episode of Capitalism Hits Home. The next two podcasts I want to do are about big changes that are happening in the United States. Today, I want to talk about the change that is happening because American citizens are deeply engaged in something that isn't actually happening in our own country, but in Israel and Palestine. The next one I'll do is about changes that are happening in labor, which has become active and militant for the first time in many, many years. Now for the first topic, the change that's happening, because it's the first time in my long life that Americans are actually engaged, or I can see their engagement in an activity that does not involve Americans. Even though we've committed many wars overseas, Americans were there. And so American news and conversation could engage with things like what's happening in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. But this is the first time that I've seen people engaged with something that's happening overseas. A bit of background. This year on October 7th, Hamas, a group supposedly financed by Iran and on the side of the Palestinians, invaded Israel, which is quite a feat. Israel had a much vaunted security system, which was rather suspiciously ineffective on October 7th. When Hamas invaded on the ground, they don't have an air force, killing 1,002 Israelis, and 876 of them were civilians, so it was a humanitarian crime. Collective punishment is a humanitarian crime. They also injured 2,000 and took 150 hostages from Israel. Now, of course, there are questions of how they got through Israel's much vaunted security system. And those questions revolve around their leader, their highly unpopular, documentedly corrupt leader, Netanyahu, their prime minister, who was found guilty of many crimes, sort of like Trump, but Trump hasn't been found guilty in our courts as Netanyahu was in his, and who met for many months with the leaders of Hamas around their common enemy, the Palestinian Authority that was supposedly ruling Palestine and the Gaza Strip. Thousands and thousands of Israelites, 500,000 of them, demonstrated against Netanyahu. He was elected in an alliance with the most rigid Orthodox Jewish Israelis, who then wanted to dismantle the judicial system that allowed Israelites to have civil rights. There were 500,000 people who demonstrated for several months against this. And Netanyahu continued in power. After the October 7th invasion by Hamas, Israel started using its entire arsenal, over $3 billion of which we contribute to Israel every year, to bomb Gaza, the whole Gaza Strip where 2 million people live, killing 20,000, as of this date, 20,000 Palestinians, 70% women and children. Because if supposedly, and actually it's documented, Hamas invaded through tunnels. So if Hamas is in the tunnels, they were bombing apartments that were not in tunnels. And 70% of the masses killed were women and children. That's who was home, not the Hamas soldiers. Israel bombed hospitals, schools, even the biggest refugee camp where women and children and old people had fled the bombings. They killed 20 times the number so far, 20 times the number of Israelis that were killed by the invasion of Hamas. And for that, they have become an international pariah state. We usually think of pariah states as states like North Korea, not our ally. Americans have gotten very involved in this. Our billions have helped support the Israeli military, but Americans have become hugely involved. For example, the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a big organization opposing Israeli bombing of civilians in Gaza, has been banned by the Columbia University campus, along with the pro-Palestinian groups. Legislators, academics, teachers have been disciplined and even fired for their stances on either side, particularly on the Palestinian side of the Israeli-Palestine conflict. AIPAC, the Israel Political Action Committee, has contributed millions to trying to sway politicians to Israel's side. Of course, that's nothing new. They're very active in American elections, even though they are a foreign nation, and other foreign nations who tried to swallow and invade and influence our elections have been disciplined. It's gotten so that the left is really inflamed in this. The collective revenge on all Gazans have affected Congress. Bernie Sanders, the most well-known Jewish member of Congress, made this statement. This is a humanitarian cataclysm, and if it's being done as it is with American bombs and money, we need to face up to that fact, and we need to end our complicity with these actions. Bernie Sanders introduced a resolution last Thursday, a week ago, that would cut off all security assistance to Israel if the U.S. State Department fails to report on Israel's human rights practices, because we have a policy, seldom enforced, that we will not send our armaments to any country that commits humanitarian crimes. Sanders' resolution is a privileged resolution in Congress, which means in 10 days, the senator has to get a report from the Foreign Relations Committee, and if Israel does not come up to the standards of non-humanitarian measures against its civilian population, then the president and the United States have to cut off and bar all aid. And there's only 10 days in which that report is due. That would be amazing. I'm sorry, they have 30 days to submit a report, not 10 days. However, if that report is what we all see, which is that there are crimes against humanity, there is collective punishment of Gazans, 20,000 of them, with mass killing. They have killed 19,000 as of last week, 20,000 as of this week, mostly women and children who are home in the apartments when they're bombed. That is a first. The United States has been involved with other questionable governments, but that is the first. Humanitarian workers say, and I quote, "The scale of suffering in Gaza is unimaginable. It'll be remembered among some of the darkest chapters of our modern history." Sanders said, "This is a humanitarian cataclysm." And I think that this is an enormously important thing. Americans are polarized. Recent Gallup numbers show that 67% of Americans under 35, young Americans, oppose Israel's actions in Gaza, while progressive think tank Data for Progress said that 61 Americans overall, old and young, support a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and the end to Israeli bombing. Now, why? Why would particularly American youth identify with Palestinians? And why would people of color overwhelmingly identify with Palestinians? Well, what do the youth have to look forward to? The doors of opportunity in America, which was the land of opportunity, are closing on their hands. College education, which is supposed to be a step forward, is now prohibitively expensive. College debt has now even outstripped credit card debt in the United States. So if someone wants to go to college, they can pay about 20 years of fees on their college debt. And so the future does not look bright. Also, the job picture doesn't look good for young Americans. And overall, on every economic report, it shows that this generation will do much less well than the previous generations. For over 100 years, between 1820 and 1970, each generation of American families headed by a white male, and the overwhelming majority of families in the United States used to be headed by white males. Each generation of families headed by a white male did better than the generation before them. So people who were blue-collar workers could look forward to their children being white-collar workers. Children who were white-collar workers, their children could look forward to being professionals, like teachers or social workers or nurses. The less well-paid professionals, perhaps, but professionals. That's over. That's over since in order to get more profit, American corporations outsourced their manufacturing to countries that don't have unions, that have far lower wages. The highest wages across the East are in China, of $3.10 an hour in manufacturing. Places like Bangladesh, it's a little less than $1. And they didn't have to worry about pesky things like workers' rights, like pensions, like sick days, like health insurance, like ecological considerations, which were brought to the fore when one of the Palestinian garment factories collapsed, killing over 500 people who lived there. And so they made huge profits and brought them back to the United States, where they bought our political system, which allows private contributions, unlike the political systems in France or Germany or all over Scandinavia. And they also allowed advertising, which are forbidden there. In those countries, each party has a certain amount of allocated television and radio time one can put up posters, but that's it. And if anybody's found passing cash, since it's forbidden, it would have to be in cash, they're off of the election roster and also can be arrested. That's what happened to Sarkozy, a candidate in France. At any rate, people are mobilized, and they are mobilized like they've never been before. And they're polarized. Progressive Americans support a ceasefire now. They support an end to all civilian death, to collective punishment, which is something banned by the U.S. Whereas right-wing Republicans support continued aid to Israel, no matter what the collateral damage. One of New York's congressional Republican representatives, Stepanik, has started a whole crusade calling all opponents of Israel's bombing anti-Semites and trying to say that if you are anti-bombing, you're anti-Semitic, notwithstanding that Bernie Sanders is the best-known Jewish Senate member, or that the Jewish Voices for Peace or the Jewish Voices for a Ceasefire, which are big organizations, are Jews objecting to this, and American Jews are strictly divided in the United States. The Republicans are trying to say that this is an issue of anti-Semitism, being opposed to the bombing of civilians, even though the United Nations says this is a humanitarian crisis. Collective punishment, which hasn't been seen on this scale since the Nazis in World War II. Collective punishment is a war crime that must be pursued. Now, Hamas pursued collective punishment and killed 1,002 Israelis and should be fined. But Israel has taken it over the top, literally over the top, since they're bombing from the sky, and killed 20,000 Gazans and dislocated and made refugees out of the whole population. 2 million Gazans who are told by Israel they'll be safer if they go to the south, and they're then bombed. Or if they're safer to go in the north, then bombed. Also, Israel has restricted the avenues into Gaza so that only one crossing was allowed, allowing very few humanitarian efforts like the UN's refugee efforts to bring clean water and food, and they are therefore starving the Gazan population, Gazan women and children, and also killing them of thirst, and also killing them by bombing their hospitals, their schools, and their refugee camps, which are expected to be bomb-free. The Israelis claim that Hamas has some enemies in tunnels under these buildings, but they've only found in all their bombing and killing of 20,000 Palestinians, they've only corroborated the deaths of 50 Hamas. And so Americans are polarized, they're involved, particularly young Americans and people of color who are shut out, the people of color were always shut out of the American dream. But white youth are also shut out. The idea that you can make it if you really try, as the song says, or that if you apply yourself, or if you put yourself in debt to get an education, you will have a reasonable life. And if you work hard, you'll have a reasonable life. That's over. There is no state, city, or county in the whole United States where two hardworking people working for minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. In addition, the opportunities that are open for young people, the biggest employers are Amazon, fast food, call centers, and Amazon, fast food, call centers, and of course, Walmart, the biggest employer. All of those employers have employees on the clock. If they don't do their tasks in the required time, they are beeped and taken to task by supervisors or fired. Workers at fast food get 2 minutes and 53 seconds to assemble a burger from the time it is ordered to the time it's handed to the customer. If it isn't handed over in that time, a beeper goes off and they are reprimanded. Too many reprimands, you get fired. If there's no one in the store and someone relaxes, they are reprimanded. They ought to be scurrying over to fill the ketchup and the mustard and the napkins. If in Walmart you are in a department, let's say the camera department, and nobody comes in to buy, you are never allowed to sit down. You have to pace 8 to 12 hours a day, looking out for customers. And if you're not, you're on camera and you're reprimanded. At Amazon, if you haven't done the repetitive task, let's say if you're working on the conveyor belt, of reaching off on the conveyor belt in a repetitive movement, picking up the requisite piece of equipment and putting it on the conveyor belt that sends it to be wrapped and sent, a clicker goes off and beeps you, and then later you are reprimanded. That's why all over Amazon there are free pain meds, because repetitive movements injure people. That's the future that's open. Call centers, you have a certain amount of time to make a call. People call in because something isn't working. You are supposed to urge them to get a better package, and then the object will work. And if they don't perform the call within the required seconds, they are reprimanded. They are on the clock. That is not a future that young people want to look forward to. But those are the jobs that are open. And so young people identify with the Palestinians who live in an apartheid state, who aren't allowed to cross the border into Israel without the proper pass, and who have Israeli settlers taking over their land and making incursions into their land and killing people or taking their property, all supported by money from the United States, about $3 billion a year. And so young people identify because they feel, as Black people and brown people have always felt, that they're second-class citizens in their own country, for which they have fought and died, and which they enrich by their labor. They've had it. They identify with those who are on the outside. I have clients who dream that they're Palestinians, clients who have that kind of job, clients who are young, because they feel like they're in an apartheid state where they can't ever get ahead. And so America is changing. It's changing in that we are watching our government being engaged in a humanitarian outlaw bombing innocent civilians. And even though Hamas started it, it's as if somebody kicks you and you shoot them in the head. Hamas should be disciplined. Collective punishment should be outlawed. But also mass killing takes it to another level. And so America is changing. That for the first time in my memory, and I'm old, Americans care about what their government is doing overseas. They care about what's happening. It's touching them personally. And the good news part of it is, although our people are terribly lonely and have not been involved in any group organizations, in fact, there were before this tragedy, fewer Americans involved in any organization than were in bowling leagues alone in 1970. But now Americans are involved. They're in the street. There are demonstrations every day in support of a ceasefire, whether they're the Jewish Voices for Peace demonstrating by climbing in and overwhelming Grand Central Station in New York, or making a presence at the Thanksgiving parade, or any place else, and they have been everywhere, or in the Statue of Liberty, reading the words of the Jewish poet Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free," and taking over the Statue of Liberty. Or the Palestinian rights marches that are happening all over the United States. Look it up on your Google. Americans are beginning to care as the mass of people is being shut out of the life promise that if you work hard, you really can have a better life for yourself and your children. And that is a hope that we are emerging from a dark time in which Americans haven't cared while our government does terrible things to us and other people, to the fact that we do care and we are mobilized. And that is a hope that is real and present. It's Capitalism Hits Home, brought to you by Democracy at Work. Thank you. Goodbye for now.